Another 1,400 kilometre hop away from Adelaide was our final stop in Australia. This time we're travelling east, and our final destination was Sydney. Being a coastal city on a very similar latitude to Adelaide, we had expected that the climate would be fairly similar as well. And that was broadly true while we visited. However, we were surprised to discover that during the rest of the year, the climate is typically significantly more wet and humid in Sydney. Similarly to Adelaide, however, the amount of rainfall is quite variable throughout the year in Sydney, and a number of natural and artificial reservoirs continue to be used in order to support the water supply for the city. The Australian white ibis features prominently in these waterways, although it can also be found nesting in or foraging under many of the trees in and around the city's parks. And many other species previously observed in Adelaide can also be found in the waterways of Sydney. One of the more charming species we've observed in the southern Australian waterways is the Australasian grebe, one of the smallest grebe species at around 25 centimetres in length. One of the more striking characteristics of these birds is their position within the water, sitting very high compared to other species. We also once again encountered the Australasian Swamp-hen, although this time we noted them to be far less retiring and shy in their behaviour, noting both their extraordinarily loud and piercing calls, and a habit for menacing any cameramen that they deemed might be inconveniently placed.
I'm about to get swamp-henned again.
We were also fortunate in Sydney to observe our first chestnut teal, a commonly distributed species across southeastern and southwestern Australia, but one which we had not previously observed. We even surprised ourselves by being quite pleased to see our first directly observed gulls in Australia, in the guise of the silver gulls. We soon started spotting some less familiar species, however, and these individuals at first gave us quite some difficulty with identification, as we assumed these individuals had to be from two separate species. Eventually, however, we realised that these were in fact settler geese, and one of the most unique features of this breed of geese is that the males and females are almost entirely dimorphic to one another, with the grey females being easily identified from the white males. Curiously, however, one individual within the flock appears to display traits of both genders. We have not been able to determine the reason for this, so if anyone is able to point us in the right direction, please do so in the comments below. The settler geese would have quite comfortably taken the prize for the most striking birds on the waterways of Sydney, had it not been for the next species we observed, the black swan. Until their discovery in Australia by Europeans in the late 1600s, a black swan was considered a non-existent entity, to such a degree that, all the way back to the 2nd century in the Roman Empire, the term black swan was used to describe an event or entity that was so rare as to be nearly, if not entirely, mythological. Our final two spots were perhaps among the most surprising for us. As Sydney is a coastal city, the presence of the Australian pied cormorant is not in itself especially surprising. But at first, the sheer number of the normally solitary birds that we found was at first quite startling. It seemed nonsensical at first that the small artificial lake on which we found them could possibly support the number of cormorants we were seeing. Eventually, though, we realised that this large tree in the centre of the lake had in fact been selected by the birds as a breeding colony site. This is still a little unusual, however, as Australian pied cormorants typically nest no further than 400 metres from the sea or other food source, and this particular colony was about 3 kilometres away from the nearest beach. Perhaps the cormorants have selected the nest site to be more safe from predators. As it stands, the only species we saw really giving the cormorants any trouble was the local corvids, who were being their usual charming selves. A distant relative of the barn swallow, the fairy martin is about 2/3 the size, half the weight, and appears to occupy the same ecological niche. Although, when you consider how widespread the barn swallow's range is, the fact that there is so little overlap between the species is quite striking. While the species is described on Wikipedia as being dumpy and square-tailed, their agility while hunting over open water is absolutely unparalleled. And this may go some way to explaining why their feeding habits are so variable. Most reports of this bird indicate that it feeds quite high off the ground, several metres. But as you can see here, they are clearly quite capable of skimming along the water's surface, taking any insects that might be emerging. The species is even known to drink on the wing by dipping their bills into the water whilst they're flying, which is another impressive feat belying the strength of their flight, as anyone who's held their hand in swiftly moving water will know it will push back quite hard. Fairy martins are not notably territorial. They will quite happily share their feeding and indeed breeding sites with other birds, and they are intelligent enough to recognise when the activities of other birds will benefit them. Whilst it may look like these cormorants are being attacked by the fairy martins, in fact the diving cormorants are disturbing insects on the surface of the water, making it easier for the martins to take them on the wing. Our final spot in Sydney, and up until the point of filming the largest animal we had seen in the world, was the humpback whale. We had intended to be filming seabirds, so we were particularly delighted that the passage of our boat happened to attract the attention of a passing pod of humpback. It is a little bit difficult to be certain. However, based on the slightly different shapes of the flukes, we saw at least 4 separate individuals of varying ages and sizes. Considering that calves are born at about 4 metres long and weighing 680 kilograms, and the adults can be up to 17 metres long and weighing 40 metric tonnes, some variation in size is perhaps unsurprising. When you consider that in the 1960s, human activity had pushed the humpback to the brink of extinction, with an estimated population of just 5,000 individuals, the fact that we're able to observe them at all 60 years later is nothing short of astonishing. Although human activities do still pose some risks to them, with entanglement in fishing gear, ship collision and noise pollution continuing to affect them, their current estimated population level of around 135,000 animals worldwide, with an increasing trend in breeding population, is an excellent sign that these highly intelligent marine mammals are thriving. The coastal waters around Sydney lie on the humpback's annual migration route between their cold water feeding ranges in the Antarctic and their warmer water breeding ranges in the Pacific. As a result, we didn't get to see a lot of the most striking behaviours displayed by humpbacks, such as bubble net feeding, nor were we fortunate enough to say with any degree of certainty that we saw a calf. but we were fortunate enough to see one or more of the group we were observing lob-tailing, or tail slapping, which is theorised to be a form of long-distance communication, some form of play, or a feeding behaviour. Although given how complex and intelligent humpback whales are, it could very easily be a combination of all three.